My guest today is Kas Mohammed. He's Vice President of Digital Energy at Schneider Electric. And I was interested to read the company's mission statement, which says that electricity is the most efficient and best vector for decarbonisation. Combined with a circular economy approach, we will achieve a climate positive impact as part of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So, Kas, can you start by telling me first, what's meant by digital energy and how can you help deliver those goals?
By digital energy is really the core business that looks after buildings around the world. And by buildings, we mean here where there's basically a human-centric element to it. So if you take real estate and commercial space, if you take healthcare with the patients in there, education and universities, hotels, stadia, etc. And we recognize that buildings makes up a significant amount of our overall carbon emissions globally. When we think about buildings as well, and what's talked about there in that statement about electrification in buildings, there's lots of different energy demands, there's lots of different building services within the building's environment. And what we're really doing in digital energy is we're putting in the systems, the software, the practices to enable all of them different systems to work as harmoniously as possible, and then delivering upon that in the OPEX phase as well.
So, of course, buildings have been getting smarter for quite some years now, but do you think the pandemic has accelerated that change?
For sure, they've been getting smarter. I think we recognise that over the last sort of 10 years or so, I think the demand has driven around more and more digital type offers within the buildings landscape. But yes, I think in the last 18 months or so, what we have seen is an increased shift in technologies such as the workspace type solutions and looking at how we manage people and how we manage all the different assets within the workspace. We've also seen a lot around healthier buildings and the topic around well-being in buildings and making sure that we've got the right ventilation levels, making sure that our buildings are optimum for the occupants within there. And really, I guess the kind of theme to touch upon here is human centricity. So we're no longer looking at what the buildings are doing just for a business and trying to drive an output from that point of view. We're actually taking the assets within the building, being the human element, and looking at how our buildings will work better for the humans within an environment and get them to be more productive, a richer kind of environment to attract people and retain people going forward.
In that sort of situation where COVID really has accelerated change towards, as you say, not more well-being, it's also changed the ways people want to access buildings and how we do conferencing. What sort of, can you give us some examples of how your clients are actually responding in the post-COVID environment?
Yeah, for sure. So I think, within Schneider Electric, we've been pretty fortunate to be working with some of the technologies around smart buildings for many years. We've had a system in place called EcoStruxure Building Operation, which is essentially it's an open system environment. So if you imagine you've got all of them different services running within a building, such as the HVAC with the BMS, such as lighting systems, security systems, room booking systems, they all need to kind of integrate and work together to get the best out of them. And we've been doing that across platforms in the past. I think what's been recognized in the last 18 months is that the stakeholders involved in them various systems has grown. So we've now got health and safety, we've got HR, we've got finance, we've got sustainability leaders, all looking at these various different components within a building, and it makes sense to them now to have more input in that. They've got an outcome that they want to achieve. So if you think about within the HVAC element, you've now got HR and health and safety kind of looking at, well, we need to understand what the ventilation rates look like. I need data on that to make sure that my building is safe, to make sure that we've got the right kind of circulation going on to prevent these diseases and prevent the kind of spread of viruses, etc. And I think the conversations that have taken place really is now about how we extract value for all of them different stakeholders, how we kind of visualize that, how we put that information across so that they're all being held accountable as we put them systems forward. So to be honest, a lot of the discussion has been more around that data points. So making sure we've got the right data points, making sure that we're making kind of what was invisible before. If you imagine where people were using a building, the different spaces, how often meeting rooms were being used, by how many people was a meeting room being used, we're looking at now measuring that. So we've got the right data point in that and making it visible, but then providing the right reporting and the dashboards around that to various different stakeholders. So I've got a dashboard, I've got a report that goes to my maintenance manager to make sure that my maintenance manager understands how often a room needs to be cleaned going forward, so that we're only cleaning environments that actually need to be cleaned, and making sure that environments are cleaned after somebody's used it. But also that same data point now needs to go to my finance people, my HR people, to make sure they understand how buildings are being used going forward, and they can make real estate decisions. They can make financial decisions on how a building, and if a building needs to be used in the same way as it was before going forward.
So are these systems smart enough to, I'd say, operate on their own? I remember going to a conference not long ago where people were saying it's very difficult to actually find skilled operatives to look after the BMS systems on buildings. Is that an issue?
I think this could be a whole different discussion in its own right, but yeah, for sure, I think the skills discussion is something that is a pressing matter for our whole industry. Really, our kind of, let's say, one of the answers to it is to build more and more automation. So you're taking the decision making, or less of the decision making, out of the hands of a human, and you're trying to put the insights and the data across as clear as possible, so that it becomes a clear decision between one or the other. And then obviously we try and do more and more automated as we go along. I think we're on the cusp of moving that into the, let's say, the AI type space, so decisions are made for you.
And we often hear that design forecasts on energy consumption in new buildings aren't actually met in, or are rarely met in practice. So have you got the answer to that conundrum?
Yeah, I'm not sure if we've got the answer completely, but I agree with you. I think when we evolve a building from when it was designed to actually how it's been operated, a lot has changed. And I think that's one of the core issues, is that the intent drastically changes. And actually, when you think about it, in just the one floor in a real estate office, the layout of how that building's being changed is starting to change. Maybe the frequency and the density of people and the different loads within a space will change. So then ultimately the actual initial design parameters start to adjust, and that has a knock-on effect to so many different things within a building environment. So I think the only way to really overcome it is, again, going back to my initial point about data and measuring what's going on in an environment. If you can measure what's going on in an environment, then ultimately you can start to adjust the different parameters, the setup, the different systems in place. And I think this is when we start to look at concepts and software such as digital twinning. So we partner with RIB, which ultimately do digital twinning all from the design stage. And they actually do that digital twinning all the way through to kind of conception. And then you have software and software tools such as building analytics and building advisors that ultimately plug into the environments and start to tell you, hold on, the optimum level of managing this building is X. And at the moment, you've deviated away from that. And then coming back to your earlier point about making sure we've got the right skills, it starts to tell you, well, these are the things you need to do to put your kind of building back on course to the optimum level. So ultimately, I think digital twinning is probably a large part of the picture that we need to make sure that our buildings are at the optimum that they can be.
So to go back to the original mission statement, I read about electricity being a very efficient route to decarbonisation. Is that about measurement, or what does that, why is that the case?
So I think when you think about electrical systems, we're talking here about basically renewable energy. So renewable energy is a key part of our overall sustainability story. It will definitely be one of the parts. I don't think it will be the sole part. But then if you think about that in terms of a building environment, all of your systems now become electrical. You've got varying different loads going into a building. So I'm now driving to my building and plugging in, I don't know, a couple of hundred cars into my EV chargers at the same time. And that's at the same time as maybe ramping up all the lighting, maybe ramping up all the HVAC, and all the various different systems in my building environment. I've got people now coming and going at different times in the kind of new ways of working, let's say, different frequencies on different days. So I think, yes, data is kind of a key part of understanding how a building's going to be used, so I can manage my different systems, so I can almost predict when things are going to happen and start to see patterns in that, and make sure that I've got the right loads and make sure that I'm driving them loads in the most efficient manner. And if you imagine you do that on a one building type concept, then you could start to do that on many different buildings. And I think that's when you start to achieve the efficiencies that we need to achieve around our sustainability goals.
Thank you very much indeed for your interesting comments, Kas. I think certainly the decarbonising of the grid has made a huge difference to the efficiency of buildings already. So thank you very much for your intelligence about electricity and its impact on our buildings. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Peter.